Our guest this week is Julia Poliscanova, who is the Senior Director of Vehicles and E-Mobility Supply Chains with the NGO Transport and Environment. Julia joined Transport and Environment in June 2015 and now leads the organization's vehicles and electrification supply chains work across Europe. This includes EV, battery, and critical raw material policies. She previously worked as an EU environmental expert for the Mayor of London and as an advisor to a member of European Parliament following legislation on renewables, energy efficiency, and sustainable transport. In this interview, which was filmed at Benchmark Giga Europe event in Brussels in March, she discusses the growing European battery and EV ecosystem, the challenges and opportunities, Northvolt's recent bankruptcy, her assessment of the clean industrial deal, and much more.
Welcome, Julia, for joining me today at Giga Europe, one of Benchmark's flagship events here in Brussels, in the capital of the European Union. Julia, you work for Transport and Environment, an NGO advocating for zero-emission transport, whose main goal is to shape European environmental and clean transportation policy. And perhaps to start, could you tell us more about your journey, how you ended up at Transport and Environment, and your role within this organization, and what drives you really in your role?
Yes, thanks a lot, Brian. Really great to be here. It was actually my dream to join one of these conferences for a few years, so I'm really glad I finally made it. It's always a really great gathering. So I think a lot of people here in Brussels, started my journey by being passionate about politics. I come from Eastern Europe, from Latvia. So I was always passionate about Europe's energy independence. And I started at university writing a thesis on how Europe can be independent from Russia by going into renewables, energy efficiency. And that's how I came to electric cars. Ultimately, electricity is freedom energy. And that's how it all started. Then rewind a few years after university, I finished in the European Parliament, working on energy policies, working on automotive policies, and that's how I came across Transport and Environment. And I thought, they're a bunch of really pragmatic, smart people. It's a kind of NGO I can work with. And that's how it all started. Now I'm in the organization for over a decade, having a good time. Okay. It flies. Yeah. And today I run a number of programs at TNE. Broadly, I oversee everything the organization does on automotive, so electrification, as well as batteries and critical minerals.
Okay. So you were there way before critical minerals, batteries were so in vogue.
Absolutely. So I started working on electric vehicles, and then somewhere around 2017, I came to my boss and I said, look, batteries are a big deal. We have to start doing this. And actually, yes, today they are. I'm really passionate about politics, policies. I like external impact of my work. So you won't find me doing internal processes a lot. I know it's very important, but I'm really more on the external side of the organization.
Yeah, arguably you're combining your policy experience, but also a lot of technical experience, because I saw that you had done an additional master focusing on batteries. So yeah, you are really home in both worlds, basically.
Yes, something I understood early on is that if you really want to be good at your job in politics, you do need to understand what you talk about. People see when there's a little bit of fluff behind. So yes, I had to de-dust all of my basic mathematics, physics, and chemistry knowledge from school in Latvia to do the technical masters, which I finished a few years ago.
I was struggle with that. Okay, yeah, that's something I experience also a lot with. In my role is I'm focusing a lot on policy and geopolitics, but at the same time, people keep me asking questions about the supply chain and how the supply chain is developing, also including in Europe. But I'd like to turn to the growing European battery and EV ecosystem. Over the past few months, we have seen, unfortunately, witnessed a couple of project cancellation delays. And that's among others due to the price and technological competitiveness gap with China, but also slower EV demand growth. In other words, the European battery makers and EV manufacturers face various challenges currently in building in supply localization, so building local battery supply chain, EV supply chain, and making the EV transition. But what are the main ones, according to you, in terms of challenges? And at the same time, what are the opportunities in Europe?
So I think in Europe, we do have the biggest opportunity. Let me start with that.
Positive note,
Exactly, have to start on a positive note, right? We have a huge market. automotive market, consumer market. And that is our huge leverage. So first and foremost, if Europe does keep its policies in place, requiring the continent to go electric, we will see the investment opportunities for batteries. And because of batteries, there will be opportunities for the midstream, for components, and for recycling. That's just so important. So it's actually really worrying what's happening right now, where some of these targets on how quickly the EU will go electric are being questioned, because that's our first leverage, the market, right? Now, beyond that, there are a lot of barriers. One of the things that I perceive, notably in what happened with Northvolt. Now, I think Northvolt are not the only ones that are struggling with that, but there is an issue with our ability to scale most clean tech, but especially battery manufacturing, at the yields and the quality required, while having it at the gigawatt hour scale, as opposed to pilots at megawatt hours. And it's not that the Chinese woke up and they were naturally good at this. They just had 2 more decades to practice and to learn, right? They spent time and now they're good at it. We, right now, we can also spend time, we can learn and fail, but I don't think we have the time. So there needs to be policy to accelerate that learning. That's the barrier number 1. And that's the industry side. Now, the barrier number 2 I would outline, and maybe we'll talk about it a bit more, are the lack of smart, consistent policy to support battery manufacturing across the supply chain. If you look at what China is doing, if you look at what the US is doing, we're nowhere near with that comprehensive policy. Some movement on this has started, but we're not yet there.
And I mean, it was really interesting to talk to hear you talk about one of the assets of the EU is the internal markets, also at the global stage. I mean, the consumers basically. I mean, I've touched upon this really briefly, but one of the challenges that the industry is facing is the EV demand growth, which is lagging currently. I mean, it's still growing, but at a slower pace. But what could change this? I mean, is it purely a funding question, like subsidy? I mean, you talked about the targets, but what else is needed just to, from a policy perspective, to drive this further?
So as TNE, and certainly me personally, I do not completely buy the demand argument in Europe.
Interesting, yeah.
I actually believe that it's all about the price. So in Europe, up until this year, there was no incentive for car makers to sell more electric vehicles. What it meant is that they prioritized profits rather than the market share. So the average price of an electric vehicle last year, despite low raw material prices, was 45,000 euros. Now, you tell me, how big is the demand for a 45,000 euro vehicle?
Yeah, that's a lot of money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But it is changing. It's changing, of course, because of the pressure from China, but also because of the European vehicle CO2 standards. It's no surprise that it is this year that over a dozen of affordable electric car models are entering the market. Renault 5 is a great example. Renault 5 put their cheap electric vehicle, great one by the way, on the market in November. By December, their EV sales grew 80%.
Yeah.
So without new subsidies. So if you bring the vehicle to the mass consumer at the right price range, they will buy it. So in my view today, because these vehicles are coming finally, the vehicles that people want to buy, organically the demand will increase. Of course, it's not full story. It's not the full story, but it's a huge part of the story. And I think we forget when we are sometimes talking about the industry, we forget about it because it sounds like people don't want to buy them. No, they just today, or until today, didn't have the product in Europe. But of course, beyond that, there's a number of things we do need to do. So we do need to have smart incentives. In Belgium, it's a really perfect example. We say Belgium is the new Norway, by the way.
Yes.
And it's not because of subsidies. It's just because some tweaks to the corporate taxation, which means that everyone who today leases the vehicle or purchases it as a company car finds it much easier and cheaper to get an electric, and they have to get an electric, and they are. You see, so that small tweak to the policy that is not that expensive to the government is actually changing the market. Charging is, of course, another one. I do believe that there's a lot more public chargers today than people sometimes think. They are coming. The issue is more around the usability of those chargers, especially public chargers. How much does it cost? You sometimes have no clue, and suddenly you pay a lot more than you thought, right? So some of these things have to be solved, and they can be solved via regulations and policy measures so that it's as easy and transparent for people to charge their vehicle as for fueling, for example, for petrol.
Okay. So I guess price affordability is one of the main
It's the main one, but it is what I'm saying is that it's not about using subsidies to bring it down. It's simply about car makers rolling out mass market vehicles. And the current dip in battery and raw material prices makes this more than feasible.
Yeah. That might also result in potentially more cooperation also with Chinese suppliers. I mean, we'll talk about this in a minute. I mean, I feel we need to talk about, Northvolt. I mean, you mentioned it briefly. There was a lot of media attention again about Northvolt's bankruptcy in Sweden. I mean, despite the doom and gloom in the media, I feel that, this is not the end though. I mean, there are a lot of European projects in the mix. So we need to stay, we stay positive. But what is your take on Northvolt's recent bankruptcy and what has led to the downfall of what was called Europe's most promising battery company? And perhaps more important, what can other companies learn from this? I mean, you talked about how things in China happened. I mean, a lot of trial and error. I mean, similar things happened in China. Projects went bankrupt, but others learned from that and improved. So what's your take on this?
So I think my major take indeed is that today we don't have time, like China did, to spend 10 years learning and failing. We need to accelerate it. The question is, how do we accelerate it? And that's where we come to the truth, the reality, that the vast majority of that expertise is with Chinese as well as South Korean players. So I think we should welcome them here to Europe, but we should make sure that they work in joint ventures and that local players learn from that. Generally, there is an abundance of batteries on the market. That's not the problem, right? But from the geo-economic, geosecurity, geostrategic point of view, can Europe really afford not to be able to make one battery by a local company? Absolutely not, right? So that's a really huge learning for me. You know, if Europe made Northvolt via its policy to work together with the Chinese player, for example, then I think some of those production hiccups could have been solved. And another learning, and I want to talk a little bit more about policy. It's quite clear that as Northvolt was struggling, and maybe some, I hope not, but some others might struggle as well. I do agree there's a lot of promising companies that can still make it in Europe. Europe was too slow to change its outdated policy framework, which is too reliant on the market and this beautiful WTO, which in my view is naive and it's not the world we're living in. So we do have a few ideas now on the table as part of the automotive action plan, what is called the battery booster. So but there's still ideas, we need to implement them. What are they? Number one, rolling out much better investment support. We need to learn from the US. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. And we need to do a lot more production aid, where we actually support each kilowatt hour of batteries that is being produced in Europe to help bridge that cost gap.
A bit like the 45X in the US, basically.
Our calculations show that anywhere around 25 euros per kilowatt hour would really help. Right, so that's number one. And we can do it via state aid, so national subsidies. We can do it via the European Battery Fund. There's a number of mechanisms, but this is what we need. The second one is definitely a much more assertive policy around trade. We as TNE do think that it's time to increase the laughable 1.3% import tariff on battery cells. But we also urgently need a framework on foreign direct investment. And finally, this is something I think is quite new in Europe to say, but we just have to understand that it's so easy to buy cheaper and great batteries abroad. So we need to require and reward local purchases. And that's where the term local content requirements come in. We just, as we support this industry, we need to make sure that the likes of BMW and Stellantis have a stick to actually be serious, support and purchase local materials. And that's where local content requirements, either as an access to the EU market or as a precondition for example, public funding, like EV subsidies, can be really helpful.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, you already basically outlined a couple of the issues that the European Union tries to address with its recent policy initiatives that were recently tabled. I mean, we talked about, or you briefly mentioned the Industrial Action Plan for the automotive industry. We've had the clean industrial deal, but what's your assessment of this? Because I mean, if you read it, the whole policy framework, so they need to be translated still into measures and actual policy regulation and so forth. But what's your initial assessment of this? Is it enough? I mean, if I remember correctly, Tierney said some of the language is quite conditional, is not straightforward enough, especially around the most, I would say, contentious issues like local content requirements. I mean, I guess that would be quite difficult and challenging to enroll and adopt something similar to the IRA in the US. Also in terms of funding, I mean, I've read some statements from battery players saying, look, this is right, this is a step in the right direction, but this is not enough. And the time is really, I mean, we need to act as soon as possible. But what's your take on the recent policy initiatives from industrial policy to trade policy?
Yes, well, that's exactly it. You know, I think I overall, I feel that there is a change in thinking. There's a genuine change compared to just 1 year ago. I actually do think that the famous Draghi report that was done on how to rejuvenate Europe's competitiveness didn't fall on deaf ears. It has been heard. So there's lots of great, completely, you know, unheard of previously ideas, such as a lot more assertive on trade. So the language around using more tariffs, for example, for indirect investment conditions are really great. It's the first time that any document of that nature uses the term EU content requirements. So for the first time it was mentioned in the Clean Industrial Deal and then reiterated specifically for batteries and EVs in the Automotive Industrial Plan, right? All great. But what is really lacking is a clear time frame and detail on how to do it. In a way, something that's called an action plan or a deal should actually do, but it doesn't do. It just promises something in the future. And that's the biggest frustration. You know, almost the same week, Europe announces that they maybe will do production aid for batteries. Northvolt goes bankrupt. That's the tragedy.
It's quite the timing shouldn't be better, I think.
Exactly. So lots of great ideas, but let's just do them. And when we start doing them, this is where, you know, the old meets the new in the European Commission, because you do have the new European Commission, the new cabinets, so the new political leadership that I believe is really ready to act and really understands it and understand the urgency. But you still have the old departments, you know, people, fantastic, smart people, but they worked for such a long time defending free market. And suddenly you come and tell them, forget everything you did for 40 years. Now we like tariffs.
Yeah, it's a new reality.
And it takes time.
Yeah, indeed. But also in terms of funding, do you think, I mean, funding is not everything. I mean, you need to have the right conditions, but still the funding package that has been tabled, I mean, in our view was pretty low in terms of, comparing this to, it's difficult to compare, we might not do that, it's not suitable, but whatever China is doing, other Asian countries are doing. And also, I mean, what recently is happening also in the defense space, I mean, the EU has been juggling with numbers like 150 billion euros and even more. Is it not frustrating that for, let's say, next-gen battery technologies, I mean, a number over $1 billion for the battery booster was tabled. So is it enough? What's your take on that?
Well, I think that the COVID situation, as well as the military situation today, shows that it's possible when the EU wants. There's a will, there's a way, right? So that's possible. And actually, it's great you also brought up defense, because a lot of things we're talking about here, well, just generally, you know, clean tech and resilience is critical, because if we actually have to rely on ourselves, we have to be able to build stuff like batteries. But minerals like nickel are in a vast area of military applications, right? Lithium is actually in lithium batteries are in things like drones. We need the same type of stuff, actually. So I hope that part of that military spending also goes on actually scaling those technologies. What has been announced in the battery booster in terms of funding is not enough. I think it's the most, you know, there's a lot of good ideas, but the reality is, as always, is just the repackaging at European level of existing funds.
Repurposing,
The big missed opportunity, in my view, is the innovation fund, because there is already money there, but we're still using it for innovation as opposed to scaling, right? But that's how it is at European level today. Now, currently, right now, the biggest bulk of money, the biggest opportunity is not at EU level, it's at national level. It's the so-called state aid, right?
Yes,
so all the
okay.
subsidies. And that's where the Executive Vice President Ribera is actually reviewing the guidelines for that state aid. That's a huge opportunity for clean tech. But so far, the reforms that have been announced have been a bit timid. But this is exactly that. So we are talking about billions and billions of money across the countries, mostly countries like Germany and France, that today is completely intransparent, opaque, and usually just goes to whoever haggles and has a better relationship with the government. Instead, it's that amount of money that can already today be turned into the US IRA style tax credits or production credits.
And I guess that we need to be careful about the level playing field, right? Because that might drive competition among member states. I mean, in the end, it's good for decarbonization, but at the same time, that might drive...
Yes, but there are other mechanisms that you can use. For example, we now will have some sort of industrial decarbonization bank with less money. So indeed, you use state aid, and most of it goes to some bigger countries, and then you can top it up. You know, where there are good projects and the potential, for example, for minerals, you can top it up from this European mechanism to the member states that have less money. So it's something that can be solved. What we're missing is that brave, resolve to really change it from a per project kind of haggling to a production-based support. Look, whoever you are, Brian, if you build 10 gigawatt hours of batteries, I give you this amount. If you build 3, I'll give you 3. And this is what we're really missing.
So a pooling basically of funding across the member states then.
So the member states would still use their state aid, and whoever is the company on their territory would get it.
But you work together then across.
Exactly, exactly.
That's
and
really,
then you can top it up from the European fund.
And I guess given the recent developments in countries like Germany, who has just announced a big spending package, I think with 100 billion for climate, I mean, there are a lot of opportunities, I guess. Perhaps a quick follow-up question. I mean, Benchmark follows really closely what's happening in the US. And as you probably know, in the US, there is a clear nexus between critical minerals and the defense industry, but also between the clean tech industry and the defense industry. I mean, we've seen a lot of funding from some defense-related funds going into clean energy. I mean, that might change in the future. We'll see. But do you expect like a similar nexus growing in the European Union? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, there is a big defense policy package that will be unveiled this week. Do you expect like a closer nexus between not only critical minerals, but also the clean tech itself and defense?
Yes, I think the honest answer is that we don't yet know. But I really hope that there is. I hope we understand that defense and security, as much as it is also about that, but it's not only about, building tanks and improving your maritime or, related infrastructure. It is also about being resilient and independent when you can't rely on your partners, right? And this is where it's so important to have wind, solar, batteries, hydrogen, because they make your economy resilient. If we can't make the technology, and I'm talking about batteries, which is 80% of our energy transition because of energy system, renewables, because of transport, how can we ever be actually, independent and secure? So I think there's a huge connection, and it's great indeed that the US gets that. I think there is already understanding that critical minerals are related, but the clean tech connection is not fully there, and I hope it comes.
And I've heard from a couple of market participants, that they're hoping to have a bit more funding from the defense angle, also potentially in critical mineral projects at the EU level. I mean, they're hoping for that. Let's see whether that happens. You talked about the member states. So I guess the European Union as a rule maker, and you also talked about Belgium, my home country, in terms of driving EV uptake and EV demand. But what can the EU learn from member states in terms of best practices to drive the EV demand and the EV uptake in the member states? I mean, you talked about Belgium. I mean, are there any other interesting examples? I mean, we can also talk about Norway, which has if not mistaken, an EV penetration rate of more than 80% already. But what has led to this? So what kind of measures can help?
I think the one core lesson here is that when you have a consistent framework, clear long-term framework. You know where you're going, you don't change
the targets.
Exactly,
Yeah.
don't change
Okay.
the targets or incentives every few years based on politics. Then the market picks up and it goes in the right direction. This is the example of Norway, but it is also an example of China. Long-term vision, very clear, and then every 5 years, clear goals. And of course, there's support, supply chain, there's a lot more there. But this is probably the one core lesson in the countries across the world where you have a consistent, clear framework. The consumer demand and the EV market just goes with it. In the markets where you have stop and go, or where governments are openly anti-EV, which until recently was the case in Italy, for example, there is no growing EV market because you need to take indeed consumers with you. And if consumers are not certain what will happen from 1 month to the next, and if the government clearly says EVs are not the way to go, it's likely that you won't have that penetration. So consistent, clear framework is just so important.
Yeah. I mean, we've talked about the industrial action plan. I mean, China, you're probably familiar with us, has these 5-year plans, which of course, gives you a big, I would say, a consistent view on how the government is expecting the market to move, and also in terms of policy measures.
But what China today does not have or is struggling to develop as quickly is the market, actually, consumers, right? So they are really looking to expand globally. The US is closed for them. So for the Chinese manufacturers, battery makers, etc., Europe is such an important market. And maybe that's where we come to the topic of how leverage and on what conditions. So the leverage is our market, but what are those conditions on which we in Europe should welcome the Chinese investment?
Yeah, because that's funny, because I wanted to finish our discussion with a forward-looking question. I mean, it's difficult to use our crystal ball these days with this rapidly changing geoeconomic context. But do you expect the EV and more broadly the energy transition, what's your view on the pace? Do you expect it to slow down? Because we're faced with a lot of uncertainty, but also potentially increasing trade barriers. So what's your take on this? And then coming back to your earlier comment, I guess there is an opportunity for Europe in all this tense geopolitical context, especially regarding the relationship with China, to address decarbonization more broadly.
So on the EV market and the transition more broadly, it does not have to slow down. The transition in Europe will only slow down if policymakers today withdraw the targets or weaken the targets, right? So this is really directly correlated to the EV targets that we have. Yeah. We keep the targets, there's a signal, and then people invest, car makers bring the product, and there's business for battery manufacturers, etc. Ultimately, when it comes to the cost effectiveness of this, I think that things do not need to become more expensive or more slow, because it's a question of scale. So if you keep the targets and the direction is clear, then what you need in Europe is to develop scale. So you need to produce batteries at scale. This is when the prices go down. And there's a number of variables in that. The most important being having access to cheap, abundant renewables. We have countries in Europe where this is already the case. You also need to be really good at process efficiency and automation, right? And I think this is something that sometimes is misunderstood. I disagree that today it's cheap in China because of labor costs or because of lax environmental standards.
That's too simplistic, I think.
Exactly. It's scale, it's obviously expertise, and it is super high automation and process efficiency.
Vertical integration.
And vertical
that's
integration,
perhaps the biggest. I believe there has been so much criticism about Northvolt, but basically their strategy was completely focused on vertical integration. They were arguably doing too much at the same time,
too soon.
But their strategy was completely focused on vertical integration. So
I fully agree. But if you look at someone, so I think Northvolt did a lot of things right, and I feel very sad about what happened. I hope we, at least we try, because they did have some skills and some workers. At least I hope we, don't lose those. But Northvolt did all the things right, but if you compare them to BYD first excelled in being a battery manufacturer. It starts for them with batteries and storage. And later on, as they became excellent in that, they started vertically integrating.
To go down in the supply
Whereas
chain.
Northvolt kind of did it all from day one. You know, they almost wanted to run before they could walk. And I think that's part of the problem. But maybe I can say a few words about China and Chinese investment here. I think so. Right now, we understand that the European Union, the European Commission, as they confirmed now in Clean Industrial Deal and Automotive Action Plan, are looking at much better conditions on foreign direct investment in Europe. I think this is actually really critical.
Yes.
So otherwise, we'll just be an assembly plant, or, you know, at some point we just won't have any expertise. But I think it's not as simple as just to say the word technology transfer. You know, what does it mean? And I would mention here at least 3 things that in Europe we need to get right. The first one is most obvious. It is indeed technology and IP transfer. For example, we have almost no expertise in Europe to make LFP batteries.
And in practical terms, what does that mean?
It means that when the factory is jointly built between, for example, a Chinese and a European player, European players have to have full access to all the aspects of that technology development.
Because that's not happening currently.
It's not happening currently.
Yes.
So what you really need is to make sure that we fully understand how to do this. So this is number one.
Okay.
And more importantly, that we have rights to that. So then at some point we can continue improving this technology and taking this forward. The second big part of it is skills. Right now, there are already joint ventures, and they talk about, when they talk about skills, research centers. It's not about research centers.
Okay.
We are very good in Europe to do our own research, actually. We have fantastic researchers. It is about exactly that issue where Northvolt was struggling at this high yield commercial manufacturing. So you need Chinese engineers who know how to do this to work together with European engineers in the factory to teach them how to do that quality process development, right? And this is exactly what is happening in the licensing agreement between Tesla and CATL in the US, right? And then there is a third aspect. I think it's very important. It's not happening in the US, actually, so where we have examples, but it is happening partially in China. And this is about more upstream, more midstream in the supply chain. So we also need to require that battery joint venture to use as much as possible local components and local minerals.
To drive then the
demand for the entire supply chain. Otherwise, it's just business again for Asia.
So
right?
that would be the local content requirements.
Exactly. So you need to have this also local content requirements as part of that. And these 3 together, understanding the technology, knowing how to build it, so skills, and helping the local supply chain needs to be there together for this proper conditions on FDI to work.
So working with China and copying China's playbook.
Exactly. We'll copy from
Europe.
the best.
Yes, indeed. But being the devil's advocate, do you think that the Chinese companies will allow this? I mean, obviously, it was a great point we made earlier, saying that, we've got leverage because China is producing so much, so they need to, they're also keen to cooperate. But at the same time, don't you think that the political level will say, be careful with working together with European companies and sharing too much of our technological edge to our potential rivals?
So I think it's exactly right. The most important thing to understand is that we also have power or leverage as the EU, and that leverage is access to the market. We are the largest market in the world outside of China, which is still potentially open to these companies, right? So it's our leverage and we need to play it right. Beyond that, if you look, so I don't think it's about Chinese companies not sharing. I think it's more about whether or not the Chinese government would allow.
Yeah.
If you look at some of the detail of some of the export restrictions that are now in place, for example, for LFP, it's very interesting. They actually restrict the newer next-gen technologies, right? I believe that we in Europe would be fine to already get the current expertise on LFP just to accelerate that learning process. And then our own engineers can also do next gen, right? So I think the framework right now allows enough wiggle room for some of that proper technology transfer to happen.
Okay, interesting. Thanks, Julia. For your very valuable insights and also for your very optimistic take on things, because I think that's needed, because sometimes in the media, there is so much negativity around the EV and the battery supply chain in Europe, but there are opportunities, I hear.
There
Thank you.
are always opportunities.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Brian.